This podcast is brought to you by PwC.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Family Office Insights. I'm delighted today to be joined by Patrick Rooney from ProMeritum. Hi.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for joining us. So shall we start? If you could give us a bit of an introduction to yourself and how you work with family offices.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am, as you may have picked up by now, from the US, but I've been in the UK for going on 9 years now. And currently I work for ProMeritum, which is a UK-based hedge fund. And the bulk of our clients are family office from kind of all over the place. So there's a mix between UK, EU, Switzerland, Asia, and the US. But yeah, we've kind of come over the years to learn quite a bit about how different family offices look at investing.
That's good. Very relevant for today. So I am from obviously the professional background with accountancy, tax advice, all that sort of legal planning. You're from the world of investments. So it's always really interesting for us to hear kind of your macro view on what's interesting family offices at the moment.
Yeah, I think we've really seen a pretty major shift in the way that a lot of family offices are looking at investments, especially since there's been this kind of major macro trend in rising interest rates. Now, this is obviously something where outside of the biggest developed markets, there's been a pretty steady and stable high interest rate environment. But now that there's been this transformation where there were persistently low rates across most developed markets over the last decade or so, there's now a kind of resurgence in interest across a lot of different products, which, over the tech boom or whatever you want to call it over the last 15, 20 years, there are now a lot of alternatives out there where we're seeing a lot of flows, both institutionally and from a family office perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. And as an American, I have to ask you, and I'm sorry, you're living in the UK, a general election at the end of this year. You've got the US elections coming up. So how's that impacting the world of investments?
Well, it's funny. I always go back to when the Trump-Biden round one occurred, and when I was traveling across Europe, primarily with my previous job. And, the first question I would get undoubtedly in every meeting was, "Oh, you're American. Tell us about the election."
Of course.
And I would say, well, I'm not a political consultant, but that said, I have my opinions and I have, my viewpoint, I suppose. And a lot of my friends and family are in the U.S. So I do get a bit of insight there. I think one thing that we see at ProMeritum is there's certainly a lot of, I guess maybe you call it angst. I think on the one hand, there's obviously much more of a known quantity in the sense that, we kind of see or we kind of hope we see, we hope we know who Joe Biden and Donald Trump are, which hopefully would mean that there's less of an uncertainty around, the potential outcome. But, I think, the major thing out there now that's more of a daunting prospect, to be honest, than either of the potential candidates is actually the looming fiscal situation in the U.S. I think these days the debt burden in the U.S. is almost 100% of GDP, which hasn't happened for over 20 years.
Right.
That is, I think, a major concern, at an institutional level, at a fiscal level, and I think people are taking more and more notice of that. And, with the potential of persistently longer interest rates, as well as, looking at, now with cash plus types of investments, we can get 5%. It has changed the appetite from a lot of investors as to what is attractive. And, naturally in the world of investments, when people are looking for higher returns, that, empirically is going to mean people are going to take more risks. And so I think there's a lot of hidden risk. I think there's a lot of potential negative outcomes that could potentially come around in the near future. My hope personally is that there is some sort of addressing of the fiscal environment with either candidate, but it doesn't really seem to be in the news cycle, for whatever reason.
There's maybe a few other things.
Exactly. So, I think we have all of these, all of these really major, political and social events going on, in the Middle East and with Russia, Ukraine. And then now you add in the election, which is now only, a few months away. And I think a lot of family offices that we work with are really taking stock of, what is the next year, what does the next 2 years look like in our portfolios. And so it's something where, we don't claim to be, U.S. experts. We do have an economist who's an American, and I'm an American, and one of our risk managers is American as well. So, I think we do have a decent, finger on the pulse, so to speak. But, I think it's really, really tough for people to predict what's coming. And I think as a result, we, have both recommended and also seen from a client demand perspective as, where can we look outside of the U.S. to invest?
Yeah, I think that theme of uncertainty resonates with a lot of our client base, and it drives different behaviors, right? So for some, it's diversifying their assets geographically. For others, it's from an investment perspective, what assets they're going into. For others, still, we're getting inquiries about actually moving themselves to a different country. So I do think it feels an uncertain time for a lot of our clients.
Yeah. Have you guys seen quite a bit of kind of change at a major level as to how your clientele are viewing, the situation over there? Because I know you work with a lot of Americans here as well.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the point you made. It's the uncertainty. And it's both sides. So some don't like the idea of Trump again, some don't like the idea of Biden again. And so we do get a lot of inquiries of, maybe I'll set up, my family office is in the US, maybe we'll set up a satellite entity now, and we'll start investing more heavily, more strategically into Europe, into Asia. We do see families also thinking about backup plans, and where might I get secondary residence, even some inquiries around passports. And there's always a steady number of people who give back their US passport because the tax just becomes unappealing for them. But yeah, so I would say at the moment it's definitely a trend. But for us as well, we see that uncertainty in many regions. So South Africa, for example, China, we often get inquiries, but it's a much longer path to diversification outside from an investment perspective. So, I mean, even the UK at the moment is relatively uncertain for people who are there under the res non-dom regime. So we see inquiries that way as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think at the moment it's definitely a period of uncertainty.
I know that the non-dom UK tax rules have directly affected two of our partners. So I know that's certainly something that's on a lot of people's minds right now.
Yeah, no. And it's until there's legislation, until there's a new government potentially in place, I think that uncertainty continues. Right. So you're an American. You live in the UK. How did you end up working in an emerging markets fund?
Yeah, that's a good question. I ask myself that thing every single day. It's something that for me, I've always been a keen kind of learner. I went back to school, when I was about 30, and while my wife and 4 children were kind of questioning and scratching their heads at why Daddy's spending his time going back to school. But I've always loved learning new things, and I think from a U.S. background, growing up in the U.S., I was, I think, a more typical case than most people would let on, which was I never left the U.S. until I was 18 years old, and I had the opportunity to go to university on the East Coast. I grew up in the Midwest. And when, I had the opportunity to move to Europe and move our family, I thought it was a great idea to kind of just, experience something new. And, I think for me personally, going onto the emerging markets side from a professional standpoint was really all about the challenge. I think learning something entirely new was fascinating to me. I think you can, as I'm sure, you've had the same experience in your world. You have what you learn in books, and you have what you learn in school, and
sure, yeah.
And then there's
it's the real world.
The real world, and I think especially in emerging markets, it's quite a fascinating place as to how business is done. And, I think there is a kind of major trend, and, I love history. I love to read. And, I think, you as an American, as a proud American, I love America. I think we've had our kind of time in the sun, and I think it's going to continue for at least a couple more decades.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's very, very hard to argue that the next century is not most likely going to be in the hands of emerging markets as we define emerging markets. Simply from a kind of socioeconomic perspective, when you look at the growth rates and kind of the trajectories of populations in Africa and in Asia, it's kind of not a matter of if, but when. And, so I think that was something where I wanted to really take that on. And I think because investors are now becoming more and more comfortable with that fact, we've seen kind of China emerge at a much larger level economically. And we've seen how important they are with, for example, COVID, when we saw the kind of global halt in trade, and how massive of a player emerging markets were in that kind of whole trajectory. So for me, it was something where, kind of opportunity and time, and of course it was a bit of a risk going from, a known entity to an unknown entity, but it's something that, I've truly enjoyed, and it's allowed me to work with a much broader spectrum of clientele, and being able to go to investors all over the world, especially family offices. I find it quite fascinating, and I find I often end up spending the first hour or two with a prospect or a client, simply just getting to know their business, their entrepreneurship, what they did, how they earned their capital in the first place. And honestly, that's more interesting than what I have to talk about anyways. So I think that's it's something that's been really wonderful for me to be able to just learn as much as I can from as many people as I can.
So maybe my last question then, if you had a family office and you were giving them advice on how they are geographically allocating assets, what proportion would you be saying to have in the emerging markets?
Oof. Well, I could, of course, give a very self-serving answer here.
100% ProMeritum.
Yes. No, I think it's very much dependent upon how people are structured. And I'm sure with speaking with you, which you guys do a ton on the structuring side, it's well above my head. If anybody ever asks me tax questions, I say, I'm not even going to answer that. Go talk to Lisa.
Thank you.
But when it comes to emerging markets, I think it's very much dependent upon where their source of wealth is. So for example, I find a lot of times with family offices, they may have an entity which is very dependent on their home country. So it could be, we're in Zurich here. It could be someone who, let's say, owns a chocolate company in Switzerland. Let's give a stereotypical example. Owns a chocolate factory in Switzerland. It's an unlisted company. All of their revenues are in Swiss francs. Their employees all of their liabilities are in Swiss francs. But then, their clients may be all over Europe. They may be in Asia. So typically what we see is in my view, our best family office clients are the ones that really look at the whole picture as to how they then allocate from a listed perspective. Yeah. So, sometimes I think initially I found it quite strange when people would say, oh, we have $2 billion, let's say, and then they're only allocating, 5 or 10 million into kind of products like what we have.
Yeah.
And then you realize, okay, well, of that 2 billion, 1.5 billion is the company. It's the entity. And that's what needs to continue to grow and to thrive for them to set up their kind of generational setup for their family and for whomever else. And, for us, just finding, a sliver of the pie that makes sense, is something where I think, so to give you a less long-winded answer, I would say it would be, I believe, kind of 10 to 25% typically for an ultra high net worth setup. I think for, someone that is on the slightly lower end of the spectrum, you could say potentially go as high as 35 or 40%. But again, it kind of depends on where they are. I mean, we work with clients in Asia who want nothing in emerging markets except for 5%, which makes sense. If your revenue's in an emerging market, you want to kind of stabilize everything else. And, we work with a lot of clients in Switzerland as well, their end clients are in Latin America, or they're in, Eastern Europe or what have you. And again, they're oftentimes more than anything looking for stability. And so, I think it's a very case by case. But I guess if I were to put a number on it, it'd be, let's say 20% on average.
Well, thank you. I appreciate a number, but I think the explanation makes total sense as well.
Great.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was really interesting. And we'll see you again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks. Bye.